Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Gideon Rose. Gideon Rose has been managing editor of Foreign Affairs magazine since December of 2000. Foreign Affairs is published bi-monthly by the Council on Foreign Relations and has a circulation of more than 100,000 in English, many times more that in foreign languages. Without a doubt, it has become the most widely circulated journal on international politics and economics in the world. Prior to joining Foreign Affairs, Gideon was Olin Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, during which time he served as chairman of the Council's Roundtable on Terrorism, as well as director of numerous Council study groups. He has lectured on American foreign policy in Princeton University's Department of Politics and has been an adjunct professor at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. In 1994, Gideon served as Associate Director for Near East and South Asian Affairs on the staff of the National Security Council. Before that, he was Assistant Editor at the Foreign Policy Quarterly, The National Interest. He has a doctorate from the Department of Government at Harvard University and a bachelor's in classics from Yale University. Gideon possesses a wealth of knowledge about foreign policy and international conflict, especially regarding the emergence of the new Middle East, a topic he will elaborate on here this afternoon. So please join me in welcoming Gideon Rose to Middlebury.
Thank you very much, Ron. President Leibowitz, I should say. It's a pleasure to be back up here at Middlebury. Whenever I hear introductions like that, it makes me question. It sounds all real and legit. And I know it's way overblown, and so then it makes me question everybody else's sort of intros and makes me much more skeptical in general. So I saw that tonight there's going to be a talk here about a Gandhian approach to solving Kashmir. That sounds like it's going to be a much more optimistic session than this one, because unfortunately, compared to perhaps what one would have said in a talk like this a decade ago, the current situation in the Middle East and its immediate future is not a particularly happy one, and the prospects are not particularly sunny. But all is not lost. So let me, basically I'm going to say a few things, and I'm going to speak relatively briefly to throw it open for questions and engage the discussion at that point. I tend to give long answers to short questions, so I want to make sure we have enough time to get all your thoughts in as well. And I should say also that this is a topic that I'm working on and trying out ideas on. So this is less a finished product than a work in progress. So I will greatly appreciate all the feedback, particularly the negative feedback, although try and keep the tomatoes from hitting me exactly. Basically, I think the situation can be boiled down as follows. The current environment for the United States in the Middle East is lousy. The Bush administration has done a terrible job. It will get worse in the next few years. It will, however, bottom out. And in the long run, there are trends that will help make it somewhat better. That's about all that can be said on the positive side. I was taking a somewhat more positive line earlier today, and people who knew a lot more than me about the region were shooting holes in it right and left, and so I'm going to be a little bit more circumspect now, but I can still get the optimistic part out later on. Let me start by saying, actually, that over the years I've come to think that one's views about international politics, a little like one's views about the economy or the stock market, are driven at least as much by temperament as they are by data and intellectual argument. The people tend to be optimists or pessimists, bulls or bears, and although they bring lots of data and argumentation to bear on those points, at the end of the day, it seems there's so much stuff out there that anybody can bring anything they want, they can construct an argument. And so I think people tend to find data and facts and arguments that bear out their temperamental predilections. Realists tend to be very pessimistic, gloomy types. Liberals tend to be optimistic, sunny types. And people tend to basically see what they want to see. So I tend to be, I'm a kind of an odd duck. I'm a sunny type, but I have some realist DNA. And so what you're going to get is a situation in which basically you're going to paint a very negative picture but say it's not actually that bad and things will come around a bit in the end. Sort of a hybrid model. The Bush administration inherited a mixed hand in the Middle East from the Clinton team. The Arab-Israeli peace process had just reached its highest point and had come tantalizingly close to a settlement in negotiations during 2000 and just as the administration came to a close. And yet it had already receded from that peak and started to descend into the second intifada and fallen short. In Iraq, Saddam Hussein was weak and behind a containment regime in his box, as the phrase was, but the containment regime seemed to be crumbling, the regime seemed to be intact, and there was fairly good reason to expect that the situation would get worse over time. The trends were not in America's favor in that regard. Relations with Iran were decent, not particularly good, not particularly terrible compared to the time since the Islamic Revolution. But the reform movement, which had come into power with such hopes, both in Iran and here, had already started to peter out a little bit, and people weren't sure what was going to come next. Jihadism and radicalism and terrorism were thought to be a danger and a problem that specialists in those areas were worried about. Others thought, yeah, it's a problem, but it's not a terrible problem right away. We got that one wrong, but that was the feeling at the time. The Sunni Arab authoritarian regimes were in power and gently being nudged toward reform, political and liberal reforms in the economy and the society, but no one was really taking that very seriously. So overall, the situation was, it could be worse, it could be better. What did the Bush administration do? It screwed everything up royally. It was 9/11, of course, but in each of the areas that I just described, things look significantly worse now than they did in 2000. Iraq is well known. I don't need to go through the specifics of the situation and how we've gotten here today, but essentially we traded a crumbling containment situation for first regime change and then a botched occupation that has left the country a giant seething mass of conflicting communal violence and stateless lack of governance, which we're caught in the middle of and which seems to be getting worse by the month. The situation with Iran, the reform movement finally petered out entirely. Radicals were elected. They've moved forward on their nuclear program and seem to be recalcitrant, and they're the prime beneficiaries in many respects regionally of the mess that the U.S. has created in Iraq. Political and economic reform in the region got a brief boost from some of the Bush administration's emphasis in this area, but then quickly that got snuffed out as democratization became connected to chaos and violence in everybody's minds, and the old Sunni Arab authoritarian order has gotten a new lease on life thanks to what's happened in Iraq and the rise of Iran as well. And jihadism, which emerged from the shadows to impact everybody's lives on 9/11, has, largely because it wasn't entirely snuffed out in Afghanistan and afterwards in 2001, 2002, has made a comeback. It's perhaps less dangerous in terms of an attack on the U.S. than it was, but has got a solid grounding in the region in a variety of different areas. And is going to be a force for a long time to come. Nuclear proliferation has continued apace, and the bad guys in the region have gotten stronger thanks to increased oil revenues, and that have essentially allowed them to consolidate their position and buck attempts at change from the outside, or buy off attempts to change from the inside as well. So we're in a lousy situation, and it's going to get worse. Why is it going to get worse, and over what time frame? I would say over the next few years it will get worse. The chief reason it will get worse is that the United States is going at some point in the relatively near future, in the next 1, 2, 3 years, going to leave Iraq, and it's going to leave behind a mess. There is no realistic prospect that I can see for putting Iraq back together. Humpty Dumpty is not going to come back together, and the situation that we leave behind will either be bad or it will be terrible. Either it will be something like the mess we have now, or it will be something even worse, an open civil war among different communal factions. The effects of that will be even worse for U.S. I mean, it'll be terrible for the Iraqis. It'll make the U.S. prestige in the region drop even lower, and it will make the U.S. Less likely to intervene in any significant way and create something of an Iraq syndrome at home, which will basically take the U.S. out of the picture. Both the jihadis and the Iranians will crow and count coup at the U.S. Withdrawal, and with some legitimacy, and their fortunes will rise. And this will provoke, to a certain extent, a countervailing coalition among the old Sunni order, which will try to do some kind of balancing against the resurgent Iranians and try to make some kind of accommodations or balancing against the jihadis. And the result will be that any kind of political and economic reform is going to be totally off the agenda for a good time to come. The local reformers have been tainted by their association with the United States and by the consequences of regime change in Iraq, and aren't about to get a head of steam up anytime soon. Oil prices are likely to stay high, which will help fund the bad guys. Sunni-Shia tensions will at least continue poorly, if not get worse, thanks to the mess in Iraq. And radicalism will, in general, get strengthened by the American withdrawal, to a certain extent, a little bit like the way the Islamic radicalism and the jihadi movement took solace from the Russian withdrawal from Afghanistan. So the American withdrawal from Iraq will be a big feather in their cap, gain more recruits, and so forth. So this is a pretty gloomy picture. What, if anything, are the upsides? Well, there aren't that many direct upsides, but I would say that the picture is not totally bleak, or rather it's not as bleak as some people have argued, for two reasons. The first is that there will be countervailing tendencies that will keep some of the forces I just mentioned and some of the situations I just mentioned in check. I don't think you're going to end up seeing this terrible war of all against all in the Middle East that many people have talked about. I don't think U.S. withdrawal from Iraq will be followed by cataclysm, a regional cataclysm, something like World War I or something like that. I don't think it's going to be followed by genocide. I don't think it's going to be followed by a variety of things like that. And second, in the longer term, and this is a point about which there's how long that long term will be is an interesting question. In the longer term, the restraint that the U.S. is going to be compelled to show in the region will redound to its credit, because the forces of history, the most basic structural forces, will be on the U.S. side rather than those of its enemies. And I'll explicate that as we go forward. What are the things that are going to keep some of the bad forces in check? Well, first of all, I will mention a couple of them, which is the rise of Iran and Shia radicalism, and radicalism more generally, will make, accompanied by the withdrawal of the U.S., will basically put, I was going to say the fear of God, but that's not really a good expression in this case, into the Sunni Arab authoritarian order in the region, which will lead them to balance against Iran and come to the U.S. for protection. At the same time that they are cracking down domestically against their domestic threats and shutting off all attempts at reform, they will look to the United States to be the protector of regional stability, the flow of oil, save them from Iran, and so forth. They'll try to make some accommodation with Iran, and they won't want the United States and Iran to go to war, but they will, at the same time, want to make sure the U.S. is in their corner. So this will create something of a kind of Cold War balance in the region, I expect. Iraq will be a mess and may even be the site of an open civil war among the various factions. But there's every reason to believe, I think, that this civil war will be contained within Iraq's borders and even to certain regions of Iraq, rather than spill over into the rest of the region. Because I think that if you look at the interests of the states in the region, not of the stateless actors, not of the jihadis, but if you look at the interests of the states in the region, there's a significant degree of negative pressure keeping the conflict in Iraq in bounds. It's almost like a building with negative air pressure. It'll push it back in. For example, so I think a better analogy than World War I, let's say if Iraq does go into civil war, a better open civil war, a better analogy than World War I would be something like the Spanish Civil War, I think, in which regional powers with different views and different interests will fight a proxy war on Iraq's territory, but avoid having direct involvement with each other. For example, it is quite the Saudis and the Iranians will have different views of what should happen in Iraq. They will back different horses in the struggles there. They will even supply aid to different forces, their respective forces. But it is very hard for me to work out a scenario in which I see Saudi forces directly fighting with Iranian forces. I just don't see it happening. I don't see a variety of other actors coming in to carve out special sections of Iraq. The one that's the most difficult would be, the one that's easiest to imagine and most difficult to stop would be the Turks coming in to secure something in the north if they feel a threat from the chaos in the Kurdish areas. But we have some leverage there, and we may end up staying a little bit in the Kurdish areas ourselves. This is a scenario that Greg Gause was spelling out to me today. I can get into that if people want. That we may end up, ironically, the only area of Iraq we may end up in is the Kurdish areas, not by choice, but because we're pushed into that. But aside from that, it's very hard to get a region. I've taken part in scenario plans in which it's very hard to get an actual regional war going, even when you have a civil war in Iraq. The jihadis, meanwhile, who will get solace from our defeat and who will keep bases in places like the Anbar province and who will take heart from the general chaos in the region, will still be essentially mortal enemies to the regimes in the region who will still need our help against them. And so the regimes who have defeated them time and again, although you haven't heard that story that much, defeated those jihadis time and again on their local turf, which is why they end up in peripheral areas like Anbar, like Afghanistan, like Sudan before that, not in taking over key states like Saudi Arabia or Egypt or what have you. So they will continue to be unable to defeat their local near enemies who will essentially recreate the old order. Someone described this as being like the 1980s without the Iran-Iraq War, a sort of tension back and forth with the U.S. backing tyrannies and keeping a lid on things. Oil still getting out and bad things happening below the surface. Not a very attractive prospect, but it's real. Nuclear proliferation. The Iranians may get a bomb. It's not certain. They're a few years off. There are still several steps that can be taken either to try to buy them off or to head them off at the pass. But it's not impossible to imagine by any means that they will actually weaponize. However, the world won't end if they do. There's a lot of talk about the proliferation, a lot of talk about two things. One, what the Iranians would do with their bomb. Two, what the region would do about it. There's a lot of good reason to believe that the Iranians would use a nuclear capability for essentially defensive rather than offensive purposes. So I don't think the minute they get one, they're going to launch a missile over to Israel and wipe Israel out. I don't think it'll be a license for aggression. I think it'll be more of an insurance policy against an American attack and a general question of status and pride. So it'll be troublesome for a variety of reasons and difficult, but it's not necessarily going to lead to nuclear war. Moreover, it may not even lead to incredibly widespread nuclear proliferation in the region. The Egyptians did not go nuclear even when the Israelis went nuclear. So it's hard for me to imagine that Egypt will see Iran as being more of a threat than Israel. And however much they are scared of or annoyed of the Sunnis, they're not the Shia. They're not going to be. They're not as scared by them and upset by them as they are by the Jews. So I think that some of the talk you hear about what the consequences will be is unlikely to play out. What you're more likely to see is a demand from, again, America's Sunni authoritarian local proxies in the region for U.S. protection. So you're more likely to see the result of an Iranian bomb or the consequences of an Iranian bomb being something like, I don't know, the reestablishment of the Baghdad Pact minus Baghdad, a sort of U.S. U.S. security guarantee to Saudi Arabia, putting the various countries under the nuclear umbrella, a tighter set of alliances rather than a looser one. Those are the kind of they'll all. I'm not trying to minimize the bad sides of an Iranian bomb. All I'm saying is it doesn't necessarily. It makes the world more complicated and difficult in the region bad, but it doesn't mean you're going to see nuclear war, and it doesn't even mean you're going to see everybody jumping on the nuclear bandwagon, even if Iran actually does go forward. Finally, or in this section, the reform movements will continue to stall, but the demand for reform will continue to exist. And this gets into the last section. It's quite possible that the situation I'm just describing in the Middle East will last for a number of years. Just how long is very hard to imagine because world politics is very difficult to predict. And the Middle East has certain exemptions from the normal trends in world politics that we're still not fully aware of how strong those exemptions are. So, for example, the oil wealth and resource revenues that the regimes in the area have available to them allows them to buck the normal developmental patterns and have a to buy themselves out of the kinds of domestic changes politically and economically that would normally force various regimes to change internally if they wanted to succeed. They can use that as a way out. So it's quite possible. There are some experts who feel, my own wife feels this way, and she knows more about it than I do. I'm not sure entirely agree, but that Iran, for example, will be an authoritarian state, as will Saudi Arabia and a bunch of others in the region, until the day that oil is no longer, until the era in which oil is no longer the dominant force in the world economy. In other words, it's quite possible that the resource exemption will allow various nasty authoritarian regimes in the Middle East to avoid reform for as long as the resource is in great demand. But others are not going to be as able to do that. And the fact is that the thing that should keep us at least somewhat confident is the fact that although the Bush, in some ways, some criticisms of the Bush administration are absolutely valid, but others are not so. And it's precisely the ones that are not valid that actually should give us some hope. What do I mean by that? All the arguments about their incompetence, absolutely valid. This was as screwed up an operation and as screwed up a set of policies as any that I've seen in my knowledge, not just present time, but going back decades and decades. It's very hard to come up with an unforced error of such colossal magnitude as the decision to war and how it was carried out and followed up. You can debate whether the war itself was a legitimate action. I think it's not absolutely 100% certain that it always had to end up this badly. But the one thing that's totally, although now that argument looks even that makes me look like a rabid optimist, but or an unreconstructed hawk or whatever. But there's no question that the carrying out of the operation was was bungled so badly that any possible good that could have come from it has not come, and in fact the opposite is there. But, and here's where the criticisms by some are wrong, particularly those in the region, the fact is it was always done, precisely as the administration said, for ultimately positive reasons and good reasons, benign reasons, rather than negative ones. So we didn't actually do it to steal Iraq's oil. We didn't actually do it to further an American empire. We didn't actually further do it to do some crazy set of designs that were essentially achieving some kind of domestic conspiracy. We didn't do it just because the Israeli lobby told us to do it. So the fact is that there was perceived to be a real threat from the Iraqi WMD. There was perceived to be a real security threat in the region from the Iraqi regime more generally, and there was actually a humanitarian disaster in Iraq, and there was perceived to be an upside politically that a new set of political arrangements in Iraq that could take root and give a better life to the people there and better stability to the region overall. Not stability, but better prospects overall. So as the U.S. pulls back, as it inevitably will, from the region, the fact that at the end of the day the U.S. did actually want reasonably decent outcomes for the people involved, that it did want stability and security, that it did want growth and development, that it did want peace in the region, that it did want peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, that it wasn't interested in direct imperial control, that however ham-fisted and arrogant and incompetent its interventionism was, those interventions were driven by a sense of and a set of interests that actually had more in common with the local interests than they ever let anybody believe, is going to become clearer. All that's going to become clearer as the U.S. absence makes the heart grow fonder for the U.S. Now, this is not going to create a giant demand, but a little bit as with Europe. When the United States does too much with Europe, the Europeans get upset and angry and want the United States to back off. But when the United States backs off from Europe and doesn't get it, the Europeans start to get annoyed with the United States not paying enough attention and not being more involved. And the same kind of thing, I think, will happen in the Middle East to some extent, which is the Israelis and the Palestinians will recognize, or at least should recognize, and this is an interesting question, how much they will recognize it, that they have no answer, that they have no answer other than some kind of negotiated two-state solution. There is simply no decent answer to the Arab-Israeli conflict other than a two-state solution in which Israel eventually gives back its territories and the Palestinians basically learn to live with Israel. And that is going to happen at some point, however many years or decades until it comes out, we don't know, but that is what's going to happen. And the false dream of being able to avoid that fate on both sides, the Israelis' false dream that they'll be able to somehow keep enough and not have to make the concessions they don't want to make, and the Palestinians' dreams that they will be able to somehow eradicate Israel, just not going to come true. And if there's either the situation will continue to simmer at what they used to call a hurtful stalemate in negotiation terms, or it will ultimately get better as they recognize that some kind of negotiation makes sense, and that the U.S. is the only outside player that can seriously shepherd those negotiations. The desires for reform, political and economic reform in the region, will not necessarily take root, but if they don't, then the countries in the region will go ever more backward, ever more outside the mainstream, and essentially will fall by the wayside. If the ones that don't have, essentially the options for the regions in the regime, the regimes in the region, are threefold, or maybe fourfold. They can essentially, if they're rich, they can buy out their time and not change and maintain control, but essentially simply rest on their oil. They can, if they're not rich, they can basically opt out and be like Syria and essentially take themselves out of politics, take themselves out of the flow of the world, and become an ever isolated and ever more stagnant backwater. Or they can begin to try to make some kind of accommodations with modernity, some kind of accommodations with regional peace, stability, and globalization, and that will inevitably start a kind of reform process that will enable them, hopefully, to have some kind of development. And if they start to do that, then the United States becomes their partner rather than their enemy, and so forth. And you get, at the best, perhaps little mini Dubais and things like that starting up around. But those are the only options. There is no dramatic, long-term, positive, ultimate path. Something like a neo-modernization theory seems to be correct in that although modernization, successful, healthy, viable modernization doesn't always happen, and although the progress towards it is usually more halting and hesitant and chaotic and problematic than people expect, there doesn't seem to be. There's no good reason to expect that there are alternate paths out there that have a better chance of success in any real way that will be defined as successful by the people inside or the outsiders in any kind of long-term time frame. A simple good example of this, in the nearly 3 decades, in the generation since the Iranian Revolution, personal income in the world outside Iran, globe minus Iran, has nearly doubled. Personal income within the Islamic Republic dropped by 1/3. That's including all the oil revenues in recent years. Okay? Doubled, dropped by 1/3. That's not an accident, and it's indicative of a kind of basic fundamental trend that if you want to do well in the 21st century, you're going to have to basically make your accommodation with modernity, with globalization, and all the things that come along with that. Now, it's going to be problematic, it's going to be difficult, but ultimately, those are the questions and choices the regimes face. Now, as I said before, the Middle East may prove to be an exception for a variety of reasons to those trends. But if it does prove to be an exception, if either it's unwilling to make the compromises necessary with its traditional values, concerns, and so forth, if it can buy itself out because it's luckily sitting on a whole bunch of oil and gas and various kinds of energy reserves, that's possible. I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow. But if that's true, it's still going to be essentially a stagnant, backward area that's going to be difficult, and we're going to have to deal with some of the consequences of those failures, but it's not going to be the kind of forward-looking threat or growing threat. If anything, it'll be a sort of the same problems as now, a generation from now, while everybody else has moved on. And increasingly, it will, I personally feel, increasingly in the region, people will ultimately reject that. I see no reason to expect, this gets to where your sort of optimism versus pessimism comes in. There are a lot of people in the region who are, observers of the region, who are very sort of pessimistic, and there's certainly grounds for that pessimism. But I find it hard to believe that over, if not years, then certainly over decades, that there won't be enough people like those who wrote the Arab Human Development Reports and who recognized the patterns in the world at large, who won't ultimately help to take some steps for certain kinds of successful modernization or grapples with successful approaches to development that are there. Finally, what are the policy implications of this? Well, it seems to me that for a combination of, it seems to me the Bush administration, let me put my bona fides on the table. I'm a former Clinton administration geek, so I basically my natural default policy would be a kind of benign hegemony. I think there are a lot of collective goods out there that the United States can help play a major role in solving. I think we have an incredibly dominant position in the world, and that therefore we can and should use this position to attack those collective goods and do good for ourselves and everybody else along the way, and that we could have sold this. And we could have done, I was the type of Clinton policy wonk that was frustrated at the president's unwillingness to spend more capital on foreign policy, be more active and involved, and do more good things. I have to say that I don't think there's a space for that kind of policy now, for a few more years at least. The Bush administration has so discredited American activism, so discredited American interventionism, so discredited any kind of benign global hegemony approach that it's not realistic. So I think that essentially for tactical and perhaps even for strategic reasons, we need to, both at home and abroad politically, we need to pull back and will pull back. There will be an Iraq syndrome, and there will be a domestic feeling that we shouldn't get too involved. And I think this will, frankly, there's no good reason to believe that anybody in the region wants us to be more involved right now. And so I think that makes sense to give into that a little bit. I'm not suggesting a giant pullback or isolationism, but a restraint, a policy that essentially is we'll play less of a role, we're going to be less involved, we're going to keep our demands to the absolute minimum. Now, I think that actually does make sense. Kind of more of what in IR terms is called an offshore balancing approach. I think that's valid for the next period ahead. But I think that's going to produce its own response, which is I think that very set of policies will clear the air a bit and make people realize what they're missing and make us realize what can be done and, in effect, be a kind of cleansing purge. And we will be in a position to re-engage the region with a kind of prudent self-confidence that has not been the hallmark of our policies in recent years. Essentially, there's been people are going two different ways, as I see it. There's a sort of arrogance and hubris on the part of the administration, and there's people who have reacted to the administration's arrogance and hubris and the consequences of that with either despair or self-loathing. Despair at how screwed up everything is, or self-loathing as in, my God, we're the problem. Well, you know what? We're not the problem. We've made things worse, and we've been some of the problem in some respects. But fundamentally, the region's problems are local and internal to the region. We have tried to solve those problems, but done very badly at that task. And our backing off will not make the problems go away. If anything, it'll make some of them worse. But it will bring home the fact that we're not the issue. And it'll allow us to create the space and the emotional situation in which we can, on both here and there, which will allow us to re-engage at some point down the road in a few years when it's a little bit more propitious. Now, I'm not suggesting this is going to be easy or that it's all going to work out smoothly, because I think they're going to be, as I said, the situation is going to get worse before it gets better, and it may not get better for a very long time. But what I will say is we're entering a period now in which the expectations that we have brought to foreign policy in the last 15 years are going to have to be jettisoned. There was a lot of feeling during the Clinton years that we could not be so activist and that things would be okay. And there was a lot of feeling in the Bush years that we could intervene directly and easily and make things much better. Well, we now know from 9/11 and Iraq that you can get screwed both ways. You can do nothing and get whacked. You can lean forward and get whacked. Maybe the answer is you can get whacked from the Middle East no matter what you do. But the fact is it's not possible either to walk away entirely from the region or walk away or directly intervene to change it dramatically according to our wishes. So we're going to have to live with the region. We're still the strongest power in the world and will continue to be. And in fact, taking a breather will leave us better apt to play a role, not the one we could have played a few years ago if we had done what we should have done, but one that's more active and involved and beneficial than seems possible now when the bad odor of the Bush administration's policies is still fresh in everybody's nostrils. So I think that a timeout, as it were, like with my 3-year-old, a timeout for the U.S. In the region is the unfortunate necessity, if only because we're not really able to do much else. And if we can use that to come at the problems down the road with a little degree of humility, but humility in our ability to find answers, but self-confidence in our intentions, and an ability that trends in history are in our favor rather than against us. That's the thing we have going for us. We do have a lot of the things the Bush administration said about, Frank Fukuyama said this actually very well at one point, trying to describe the difference between his views and the neocons' views in the Bush administration, which was that he said, I put forward a Marxist viewpoint. They put forward a Leninist one. And I think there's actually some truth to that, which is some of the things that Fukuyama talked about in the end of history were a kind of broad set of historical trends that would go in a certain direction. And what the neocons essentially did was try to intervene directly in history to speed up those processes. And one of the things we've learned is that that's actually, or we already knew, but one of the things that sort of has become clear, that's a better way of putting it, is that that direct speeding up probably doesn't work very well, and it's resented dramatically by the people who were the targets of it, especially if you do it incompetently. But that doesn't invalidate some of the more basic points that Fukuyama and others were talking about beforehand. It doesn't invalidate the fact that some of the broad trends in history still are going in our favor, and that there aren't dramatically different paths on offer that will actually redound to other people's favor and against us. So if we take our time out, things will still be okay when we come back, and we'll actually be in a better position because we'll be able to re-engage with cleaner hands. With that, let me throw it open to you guys for attacks, whatever. I'm happy to take questions. So, Mark.
Thank you very much, Gideon. Very interesting, very informative. I have a two-part question, and you're starting to get to it at the tail end of your comments. You laid out a scenario in which there was a mixed record around 2000 in the Middle East, and the American government took that and made it worse. So my question is, why did the United States make so many mistakes in the past? That's the first part. The second part is, how can we avoid making those types of mistakes in the future? And if you were to cast that in terms of variables, what were the key variables, the fundamental variables of the mistakes in terms of the policy, and what should we focus on in terms of avoiding those in the future?
The fundamental mistake of the Bush administration's policies has been hubris, has been irresponsibility and recklessness, and combined with basic incompetence. The way around now there's something worthwhile about this. Why? Because the question of why is an interesting question. And here I would say very briefly, this gets into IR theory in the sense that I think that the Bush administration's particular flaws were enabled, were abetted and supported, were underwritten, whatever synonym you want to use, by America's global hegemony and the immediate circumstances of 9/11 and its aftermath. The Cold War ended, leaving the United States at the beginning of the 1990s with a dominant position in the world. Everybody assumed, here and abroad, that that condition was temporary. Even the hegemonists, you might call them, felt that way. Charles Krauthammer wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs called The Unipolar Moment. And the reason I highlight that is because even someone like Krauthammer thought of it as a moment. The question was, how long would this moment last? What would it transition to? And what should we do in the meantime? And the debate was between people who thought, well, we should quickly return to a kind of multilateralism and multipolarism because that's what's going to come, versus those who felt, no, let's use our brief moment of freedom of action to do more aggressive things. Well, what happened during the 1990s? Exactly the opposite of what everybody predicted. Instead of coming back towards the pack, the United States lapped them again. At the turn of the century, the United States was stronger in relative terms than it had been a decade earlier. Nobody expected this one. I can tell you that because I was following these debates. And so why didn't the United States do much in the previous 10 years? Well, because Clinton was nothing if not a superb domestic politician. And his judgment was that the American public would not want to spend a lot of money and time and effort and blood and treasure on foreign policy. And so there was a domestic political constraint on the administration's use of its power. And so essentially American foreign policy was put on autopilot largely during the Clinton years, with the resources, the fundamental resources, piling up in the bank, the interest rolling over and accumulating. This led to a situation around the turn of the century, turn of the millennium, in which the United States was stronger not just than it had been, not just than other people, but literally, as all the rhetoric had it, stronger than any other state in the modern history of international relations. The talk about a new Rome was not overdone. You have to go back to a situation like Rome to come to a degree of material power in old-fashioned terms comparable to what the United States has today. and still has, I would say, today, and because we're still in hard power terms in the same situation. The fact is there is no significant peer competitor. There is no significant opposing alliance. There is no significant security danger other than stateless terrorists to American soil and interests. We are extraordinarily dominant in the world. Now, I say that as a description, not as a kind of it's not self-puffery. It's just a description of the actual reality of what that is. Now, what that does, it has one significant consequence. It allows the United States to ignore, and in particular it did in the early years of the century, it allowed the United States to ignore what anybody else thinks. The Bush administration came into power able to do whatever the hell it wanted without regard to what other countries thought. No other countries could do it. Now, it couldn't buck reality, but it could buck other countries. You don't want to go to war? Fine. We don't care. We'll do it anyway. We don't do this. It could do whatever it wanted externally. But if you look at 9/11, if you look at the first 9 months of the administration's policies, they're rhetorically different from the Clinton years, but not that different from the Clinton years. And I would argue that that's more of what you would have seen until 9/11. What does 9/11 do? 9/11 does two things. The first, and the one that's rather obvious and everyone knows about, is it drives people to an awareness of a new set of enemies, a new set of problems, a new set of issues we need to contend with. Jihadi terrorism becomes the prime issue on the table. But it also has a second, and I think at least as important effect, which is it convinces the American people that they should unlock the account and let the administration use American power to serve whatever interests it sees possible. The public gives the administration after 9/11 a blank check. It says, get the bastards who did this and make sure it doesn't happen again. We're not going to micromanage you. We're not going to interfere. We're going to take your version of this. You're the boss. We elected you. You're supposed to know how to do this. You go ahead and do it. Congress basically rolls over, does nothing. Public has a complete blank check. And that removes the domestic checks. So for the first, I think the post-9/11 situation is historically unique because of the combination of the absence of external constraints, and internal constraints. That gives the decision makers in the White House an extraordinary freedom of action. That's what defines their situation. It's only in those structural circumstances, freed from external and internal checks, that whatever ideological idiocies or characteristics psychologically and personally they may have matter. If they were in a different situation structurally, it wouldn't have mattered what they thought nearly as much because they would have been checked from doing things. However, once you get into a situation in which you have no external or internal checks, then the views and characteristics of the people in power matter hugely. And I'll get to you'll be the next one. And so what happens is that I think 9/11 is a kind of the Afghanistan operation is a kind of knee-jerk reaction to 9/11. I think almost anybody in power would have done pretty much the same thing when they figured out who had done it, and the Taliban wouldn't give them up. I think the last few months of 2001 are pretty simple to explain. But then you have this great moment, this sort of gap in early 2002, this historical gap in which there are all sorts of possibilities that could have taken place. The path that was set in Iraq and after was the choice of a few people in the White House and administration, the White House and Pentagon essentially, and that would have been done very differently. You wouldn't have had a war with Iraq, I think, at the time and place you did if Gore had been elected, and you wouldn't have had it with a number of different presidents. You had it with Bush, and then you had a certain it was carried out with a certain degree of hubris. Again, and I think it was basically because freed from all constraint. I think one of the big, freed from all constraint, they do whatever they want to do, and they have no checks. And what happens to an absolute power? It corrupts absolutely. And it doesn't corrupt them in terms of their interests and intentions. It corrupts them in terms of their irresponsibility and their unwillingness to listen to opposing views and their unwillingness to brook dissent and to bring a kind of prudence into their calculations. The great tragedy of all this is there's nobody who understood this stuff better than the president's father. What was the signature text? Those of you from Saturday Night who watched Saturday Night Live in the old days will remember the plays that Dana Carvey used to do. Not going to do it. Wouldn't be prudent. Okay, you had a president who said not going to do it. Wouldn't be prudent. Would that we had in this time a president who said not going to do it. Wouldn't be prudent. The lack of prudence. Prudence is the kind of thing that small states, weak states, powerless people have to take into account. When you're incredibly big and strong, when you're the 800-pound gorilla, where do you sit? Well, wherever you want to. And it was that very lack of prudence that I think underwrote the incompetence and extremism of the administration. That plus the personal characteristics and ideology of the people involved. So I think some of that will have already been taken back down. I think that we're in straitened circumstances. Our basic underlying resources of power are still there, but we have no disposable cash in terms of military or other areas. And I think that the public has a hankering for competence and prudence and restraint that will lead the rest of this administration and the next one to essentially act more prudentially than we have seen. And I hope that will be the case. Maybe I'm fooling myself, but I hope that will be the case. But with that, let me give him too long an answer. I'll try and keep the answer shorter. Yes, over here.
I'm absorbing all of that, but I had a question about something you said some time ago that led me to doubt how strong and robust this American strength is that you've talked about. And in particular, let me just mention a few structural facts. That the U.S. is now more dependent on imported oil than it was 5 years ago and 10 years ago. It will import about 66% of its total oil requirements by the end of this decade. They'll pay a lot more money for it, money which increasingly will have to be borrowed. Our major creditors up to now have been China and Japan. They've just been replaced in the past 6 months by the oil exporting countries, who now have another tidal wave of petrodollars, which they may not be so willing to use in buying nice, safe, low-yield treasury bonds. They may decide to do something else with it, especially when you look at the reputation for the U.S. in this part of the world. I'm wondering, given this import dependence, credit dependence, and low popularity, how robust is U.S. strength? And I worry that you might make the same mistake that people did in the Vietnam era, that hard power, the ability to destroy a country, can somehow be easily equated into political power to persuade people to pursue some common objective. I don't see that happening. And if you want to qualify it, let's say it's a very vulnerable superpower. One false step could shatter a lot of images.
Very good points. I would separate out one from the other, which is what hard power is good for is a very valid question. When I used to do security stuff, guns and missiles and that kind of thing, and did a democracy promotion project a few years ago, and it was fascinating because there were all sorts of the kind of tools that you could use in some spheres proved totally unusable or less good in other spheres. And I started to realize that, I mean, I knew this well, but I started to realize in a very, very practical way that there are some tools that are like string, okay? A string is very good for pulling something. It's very bad for pushing something. And so hard power is very good at some things. It's very bad at other things. And understanding just what it is good for and what it is not good for is an absolutely crucial task, and I agree entirely that what we've seen in Iraq is a perfect demonstration of the fact that the politics on the ground will matter more at the end of the day than the firepower you can bring to bear on it. Your first point, I think, is a somewhat separate one, which is about how valid and how sustainable is this hard power that we have. And what I would say there is, I think you've put your finger on some of the things, the fiscal policies, the debts, and so forth, that are the greatest weak points in the current situation. And yet another reason to be annoyed at the Bush administration for its incompetence and irresponsibility. But I'm not quite as worried about that as some people are. A lot of economists I know are worried about that, but some aren't. And part of the reason I'm not worried about that is, well, I wouldn't say I'm not worried about that. I think these are major problems that need to be addressed. I'm not as worried about that bringing down the whole house of cards, because if you look at other players in the world game, they all have dramatically worse problems. However, we tend to focus on our own issues, and it's easy, I think, or possible, just as it was possible for the Bush administration to look at our strengths and become infatuated with our strength, so it's possible to become obsessed with our weaknesses and our problems because we know them very well. But comparatively, I would hold dollars rather than a lot of other things, and I would put stock in America in a variety of ways. And I think the markets to date have been saying that same thing. They could always turn a little bit, but if you look at the other problems that Europe has, that China has, that Russia has, that various other regions have, yes, you want to diversify, yes, you want to place bets in a variety of ways, but I don't see the power is a relative consideration, and I don't see the alternate contenders coming up. I mean, again, comparatively speaking, if you look back in history, what were the great challenges that people faced? War, depression, famine, disaster. The trends in these things are extraordinary. We are in a period, in the 1980s, John Lewis Gaddis wrote a piece in which he pointed out that in 1986, I believe it was, that we passed a historical milestone, and that he suggested renaming the Cold War, because at that point, the Cold War had lasted longer than any other period in history without war between the great powers of the day. And he said that, look, we should think of this as the long peace rather than the Cold War. We focused on its tensions, but in fact what's historically resonant about the Cold War is its lack of conflict. Never before in history was there. Now, what's happened since then? What happened since then is that period has been extended another 2 decades, with the other major evil contender dropping out of the picture. You have a situation in which not just is the U.S. the dominant power in the globe, but the several other powers next to it in real capabilities are its allies and our democracies, and are essentially removed from history in some kind of post-historical state. There are contenders and challengers, but we have a situation in which, by and large, the world economy has moved forward and is globalizing, and if we can keep up a trend towards generally free and liberal trade across the globe, you will have a situation in which you have ever-increasing aggregate goods, which we can debate about how they need to be distributed. We can debate about the policies domestically that we should have about inequality and social programs and so forth. But essentially, the broad trends of how to control the international economy so as to head off the depressions and famines and disasters of the past, largely solved. Largely solved. And you have a situation, therefore, in which, by historical measures, not just is the world in pretty good shape, but the U.S. is in pretty good shape on top of that world. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't major problems you have to deal with. And it doesn't mean that the strengths we do have are able to be deployed necessarily against some of the problems, for example, such as the Middle East has. But it does mean that there are 2 things we can do. One, we can refrain from doing stupid things like trying to solve problems that aren't amenable to the solution of hard power with hard power. So we can not do stupid things like shoot ourselves in the foot. And the second thing we can do is we can try to insulate ourselves from the problems that do exist through sound policies. That would mean not just winding back some of the economic and fiscal policies that you were talking about that led to the situation you're describing, but it would also mean that energy dependence, it's not so much that I'm concerned about energy, I'm not concerned about energy dependence in terms of foreign dependence, because we're in a globalized economy, the market clears globally, and it's not that I worry about the fact that U.S. oil is coming from Venezuela or Saudi Arabia rather than Texas. It's that there's too much money going to oil producers. Tom Friedman had an article in Foreign Policy called The First Law of Petropolitics. It was a little bit banal and simplistic, and it wasn't all that original, but it was basically more right than wrong, which is the oil price essentially correlates with increased strength for bad guys. High oil prices, high energy prices fund bad guys. It allows them to escape the pressures they would need to reform, and it allows them to use their money to do bad things. So whether it's from your environmental causes or from geopolitical causes or from economic causes, all three of those would seem to lead towards the idea that a major shift in our energy policy is an obvious no-brainer thing, and that if you want to know what we can do with the Middle East, start having an energy policy that involves conservation measures, research into alternative energy sources, some kind of gas tax or carbon tax. That would be not a universal solvent for all the problems of American policy everywhere, but a pretty good start on a number of them simultaneously. So I would absolutely say that. So what you can take from these kind of things is we should keep our own house in order and insulate ourselves from the problems. But I don't think that means that we're weak, pathetic, bad, evil, and on the way out. I think that there are ways we can shore up our position if wise policy is about, if that makes any sense. Yeah, yes, back there.
If Colin Powell had resigned rather than giving his speech at the UN, would things have been any different?
Yes. It's funny. My wife asked me, there was a report this morning on CNN.com that a bunch of ex-CIA officers had written a letter denouncing George Tenet as the horrible man who's trying to escape blame for his problems by blaming others. And she asked me what I thought of it. I said it was somewhat overdone. And I said that in my take on things, Tenet was in the same situation as Powell, in the sense that you can think of three levels of responsibility for this mess. Putting aside, for chief responsibility, you can put aside all the rest of us who went along with it, and maybe other people would put the pundits in the media class and people like me in there too, and that's possible. But the highest levels of responsibility for all the stuff I've been describing, but particularly Iraq. At the top level, you have the Vice President, Secretary of Defense, and the key players of the Pentagon, who basically originated the policies and supervised them and kept everybody else out, along with the president who essentially let himself be led in that direction. There's very little evidence that he drove the policies, but he empowered the people who did drive them. So I put those people at the very top. The next level down, you have the top technocrats who went along without saying boo because that was what the administration was doing. And I think you have people like Rice and the top military leadership at that level just below. Just below that, I think you have Powell and Tenet. Powell and Tenet fought a little fight, a little rearguard action inside. They tried to get the policy stopped. They're correct to feel betrayed by the administration because they tried to fight against some of the policies that were put in place. But ultimately, when they lost those internal fights, they went along rather than resigning. Now, the people who criticize Tenet for resigning, I'm not going to say that they're wrong, but it's a tough call if you're that high up. I mean, I think that Colin Powell, Tenet was more central to the intelligence effort and the war effort than Powell was, because Powell was always on the outs. On the other hand, Powell had a much greater public position, and his resignation would have been much more significant than Tenet's. No one would have given a shit who Tenet. If Tenet left, it would not have made a big stir, whereas if Powell had left, it would have. So I think that Powell, yes, he bears a significant amount of responsibility, because the tragedy of Powell is I think he would have been a good Secretary of State under a different president. And, I mean, there's a great line, a lot of great lines in The Godfather, but at one point Michael's replacing Joe Hagen and, Robert Duvall, and he says, why? And he says, look, I didn't think that you were a bad consigliere. I thought, Sonny was a bad Don. And you're just not a wartime consigliere, and I need a wartime consigliere. Colin Powell basically was not a bad Secretary of State. He served a bad Don, and he didn't have the he didn't have the strength of character to play the one card in his power in his hand that would have been potentially worthwhile, which is to fold. And he did not play that. That was his one move. Why didn't he do it? He's ultimately a good soldier. Same reason he didn't run for president in '96. It would have been staking too much. It would have been putting everything on the line in a kind of gamble. And he wasn't ultimately prescient. See, but this, I would bring this back to power. It's not just as a variable that I'm very comfortable with, but there are a lot of echoes of Vietnam in the current syndrome, more echoes than I would ever have thought we'd see again. But one of them is this incredible can-do sense. This power that I was talking about, and this sense of hegemony and this sense of arrogance that we can do whatever, and particularly in the U.S. military, which is the finest military ever on the face of the planet. I mean, these guys can do practically anything in the purely military sphere. They didn't realize what they couldn't do, of course. But there's this incredible sense of saying, we'll do it. We may not like it, but we can get it done. You see things in terms of more difficult and less difficult, but the kind of, that's just a task that we cannot do. That's an alien concept, not just to Americans in general, not just to high-serving officials in an incredibly strong power, but also to the American military at the time of American power. And so that's what Colin Powell, it was probably hard for him to get his mind around the concept that it would screw up this badly. But you know what? I've asked a lot of people inside, in retrospect, we've talked about this, a lot of people in the field, even people in the field, not all of them, but even a lot of people who were critical, said they could never have imagined that it would be this much of a screw-up. And this gets back to one last thing about Mark's point, which is you have to be a specialist in American foreign policy to realize just how puzzling these last several years are. In one sense, it's the oldest story in the book. Great power leads to hubris, leads to folly, and which leads to nemesis. Okay, it's the oldest story in the book. Every Greek tragedy and basic laws of old classical realism. But how that played out, this was in nobody's interest that it worked out this way. And so the story is either the story is not simple and logical. It's either complex and logical, because there are a lot of things going on we don't know about, or it's simple but not logical, because it played out to start a war of choice at your time and place of your own choosing against a much weaker power and bungle it so badly without even thinking about what will come next. It's mind-boggling. It's that you have to just how mind-boggling it is. You have to actually do this for a living to realize how mind-bogglingly stupid it was. And I think part of Powell's thing, here's this great crime, which is that someone like me got it wrong, at least partly, because we assumed that people inside would be doing things to take steps to make sure this worked out okay. Because of course you would do that. It's just illogical. In Strangelove, there's a wonderful scene in which the Russian ambassador was brought in, the Russian general, the Russian was talking to the thing, and they describe the plans, and they talk about the fail-safe device, the doomsday device. And they say that they have the doomsday device, and therefore if the American planes get through, it's going to be the end of the world. And the Americans say, "You have the doomsday device?" And they say, "Yeah." He said, "But don't you know the whole point of the doomsday device is that you tell people about it so that it works for a deterrent, right? If you're going to blow the world up, it's your ultimate deterrent. To have the doomsday device but not tell anybody is, we were going to get around to telling you, we didn't tell you. It doesn't make sense. And there's this wonderful scene in which the Henry Kissinger, Dr. Strangelove type is sort of puzzled by this because it makes no sense to have had that device but then not tell anybody about it. And that's the kind of thing about what we've done in Iraq. It's so crazy to have done what they did that it has the professionals in the field going, and how do you do this? Powell was in a place to know that. And he didn't. Either didn't pay attention or was so concerned to keep himself on the sidelines or didn't want to lose his position or whatever that he essentially got. So, yeah, I think history's going to judge him pretty harshly, and he's something of a tragic figure. But he's a tragic figure not because he did the bad things, but because he could have stopped them and he could have enabled them, or at least tried. Yes, over here.
I have a question more related to your question about what happened to Iraq, the U.S. involvement there, that granted that the U.S. was engaged relatively in the next 2 or 3 or 4 years. What happened to the stateless actors, as you termed them? And recently we heard the high-level Al-Qaeda operative was caught in Iraq. He had moved from Afghanistan to Pakistan. Now, I think we could safely assume that Iraq would provide them a safe haven Would the U.S. be opting for an option of fighting them somewhere in Chicago and New York, like disengaging rather than fighting them in Iraq?
When I was at a discussion the other day with people about what would happen after the withdrawal from Iraq and what the Middle East would look like, I was trying to get my mind around what people were saying, and it occurred to me that you could sum up the fact by saying the Bush doctrine was going to die, was not going to be revived, but that the war on terror was going to be with us for a long time. People have said, oh, the war on terror is a crazy concept or a silly one, or you can't have terrorism on a concept. Sure, call it whatever you want. The conflict against radical jihadism, for want of a better or more elegant set of terms, is going to continue, because the fact is, although they are a small subset of a small subset of the Islamic world, there are indeed quite enough radical jihadis who want to pursue their vision with violent means and are going to go against a lot of things that we hold dear here and elsewhere. And that's going to be a problem for a long time in a lot of places. The question is not is it going to be a problem, but how do we deal with that? There's an article in the current issue of Foreign Affairs which suggests that Iraq has made that problem worse rather than better. I think that by and large makes some sense. So you're going to have to deal with the threat of the jihadi terrorist network and its various successors, but it's in a variety of ways. The way to think about this, we don't have too much time, but there's a small core of people who you cannot deal with, you simply have to kill. You have to hunt down and kill. There are diehard terrorists who are like people in 24, and you just simply have to go after them and get them before they get you. Around them is a broader circle of activists who are cadres who you might be able to peel off in various ways through various different kinds of policies. Some you might be able to co-opt, some you might be able to deter. You work on them with a different set of policies. And then a still broader circle is a large base of population in the areas and communities that the jihadists thrive, and those you need to get to stop cooperating with the jihadists. And so you need to have a broader set of policies that essentially make it so that the jihadis find it difficult to gain support, funding, safe haven, and so forth among their own populations. Basically, you want to make it so their own populations will start to reject the alien virus. And that's a broader, difficult, tough challenge, but it's one that we have no choice but to. But none of these things, it involves intelligence, it involves certain kind of covert military operations, but it doesn't necessarily involve taking over entire countries, and it doesn't necessarily involve incredibly major military operations. So the answer is, in some sense, yes. We're going to be living. We're going to have. I lost on the way up here shampoo, conditioner, shaving cream, and some nice scrubbing beads for exfoliation. And you know what? You're going to be dealing with crap like that for the rest of your lifetime, probably. Because the threat's there and it's real. And if it's not these guys, it'll be somebody else, and biological stuff will be even worse. Your children's children will have to worry about even that kind of thing. So it's not easy. But on the other hand, the odds of any successful attack on a major scale are pretty low. So what I would say is you trade it off. Here's the thing. Your parents and grandparents, great-grandparents, your great-great-grandparents had wars. Your grandparents and parents had nuclear terror, and we have sort of terrorism in its various forms. And these are all sort of existential threats that worry us and keep in the back of our mind, but they trick us how to go about our own lives and not let it bother us too much, while hoping that our governments actually do somewhat sensible things to reduce the threat to as minimal as possible. One more. Yes, over here.
What's going to happen to Europe?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I'll bundle you and you. Okay, good. I'll keep it short.
What's going to happen to Europe?
What's going to happen to Europe? Okay, and over here, you're.
Do you see any, under your scenario, do you see any role for USAID?
Second first, USAID. Smart development makes sense. I see there being a role for democracy promotion and aid and development in that last question in dealing with the general populations and in carrying out what I said before was the good U.S. intentions. There's every reason. Look, the ironic part of all this is we actually are in favor of development. We actually are in favor of democracy, but everyone thinks that we're not. It's kind of crazy. We managed to screw ourselves like that. All we have to do is follow technocratic best practices, wisely understood, in a variety of areas, and we can get back to some kind of better odor and reputation. It's not going to do much. The fact is technocratic best practices, this dirty little secret is they don't get you very far, but they get you somewhere. And on whether it's the National Endowment for Democracy, whether it's USAID and the World Bank, having Paul Wolfowitz there, not a good thing, but getting back to fairly serious technocratic policies that would show the world and put some money and some effort and some serious expertise behind that. Let Jeff Sachs have some of the things that he wants and try to have it done properly administered and so forth, make efforts on AIDS and global public health and other kind of things. You can do that and it'll help somewhat. It won't achieve everything that we want it to achieve, but you could spend your money a lot worse and effort a lot worse, and we should do something in those fronts. With regard to Europe, we keep running these articles in Foreign Affairs that say that Europe doesn't have to face stagnation and decline and whatever because it could get out of it by doing this or this or this. And they're all legit, and the arguments work. Except that when you look at them carefully, there are always these things that they keep not doing. And so Europe has three major problems. One is they have an aversion to confrontation that is the flip side of our aggressive acceptance of confrontation. Bob Kagan, in his book, had a nice image of two people confronting a bear in the woods. And he said, how are they going to react? And he said, you learn a lot about these people, but what would really tell you more about how they would react to the bear in the woods was whether they had a gun or not. The one without the gun is going to run away from the bear. And the one with the gun will try to shoot the bear. And his point was that Europe is like the country without a gun, the guy without a gun. They will run away from the problems. And I think that's absolutely true. But he didn't quite go on to say is the United States is like the guy with the gun. They will try to shoot the bear. So they're, just as we are probably somewhat like their caricature of us, so they really are a little bit like our caricature of them. That's a problem. But it's not, that's an acceptable problem because, you know what? We have the gun. And if we use it wisely, we can protect them like we've been doing for the last half century. It's not a problem. I'm actually comfortable not having the Germans play a major role in world politics. It doesn't bother me. Given all the things that went wrong when the Germans did play a major role in world politics, it doesn't bother me. As long as we use our power wisely. Second thing that their second problem is economic reform and liberalization and basically figuring out a way to deal with their domestic situation that will enable them to be competitive in a global economy. This is a difficult challenge. It's not one for me to talk too much about since it's not my area. But let's just say that there are things they can do to stay. There's no demographic inevitability to their decline. We have an article in the new issue of Foreign Affairs that basically says if they just lengthen they're going to be very healthy old people, and if they just lengthen their if they get their retirement people back into the workforce, which they can for a variety of reasons, things will be okay. There are all sorts of things they can do on structural reform and basically end up, the short answer there is they can sum it up by saying you can save much of the European model if you become like Scandinavia. So you can't be like Germany and France probably too much longer, but you can be like Sweden and Norway and Denmark, and you can basically have a good social a set of social programs and a much more benign, caring set of policies than the United States, as long as you can make them tenable with globalization, with free trade, with a modern economy, and so forth. The third thing is the Eurabia kind of thing, the sort of domestic Muslim problems and the question of integration. And this actually is a little bit like the second one. It's a related issue. I think a lot of the doom and gloom about European Muslims and the threat they pose is dramatically overplayed. Jessica doesn't agree with me here, but I think that the situation is troubling, but it's a larger one that has less to do specifically with the new immigrants in Europe than it has to do with European nations' ability to be more like the United States in terms of being welcoming to those immigrants. So there's a real challenge here in the sense that just as Europe has to make its peace with a global economy, it has to make its peace with a diverse set of populations, not through multiculturalism, but through more of, ironically, an American-style policy that essentially brings its minorities and its new populations into a full citizenship within the confines of liberalism. Now, that's going to be a real challenge, and it's not one that they're doing very well, and I hope they do well on that one. But essentially, I think that it's a generation ago, and 2 generations, for the couple of years before that, there was an obvious commonality of interests between the United States and Europe. And everybody knew that we were on the same side against the bad guys. And we kept fighting on the same side, whether hot or cold. Now there's this growing gulf between the two sides of the Atlantic. And I find this very disturbing because there still is the same commonality of interest. We're still a condominium of the advanced industrial democracies. We're still basically the cutting-edge powers who should be together. And so I think that we can learn from them not to go around shooting our gun off in the woods recklessly and to pay more attention to various domestic problems in the ways that they do. And they can learn from us, not just about the need to face some real threats, but also domestically and foreign threats, but about the ability to engage the future in a globalized world with a truly liberal viewpoint, one that essentially takes the challenges of modernity seriously and brings everybody into that, including their new populations, opens themselves up. What European identity means in a 21st century in which you have a global world is a fascinating question. And I guess what I would say is that Europe is going to be our partner, and it's in our interest and their interest if they do well. I don't see them as a threat or an enemy. I don't see them as a rival. I see them as a partner, and I wish that they could be as strong and vibrant and healthy as they can be. And I think it's our job to sort of help them be that way and to learn from them in the areas that we can learn from them, just like it's their job to learn from us in the ways that they can learn from us. So that's a weak answer, but still. With that, it's going to